Welcome to Open Work, a look inside the watch industry, a podcast from Collective Horology. I'm Gabe Riley, co-founder of Collective.
And I'm Asher Rapkin, co-founder of Collective.
Collective Horology is an independent watch retailer based in Southern California. We carry a wide range of independent watch brands, including Chapek, Fears, Nicholas Hacko, and more. And we're proud to announce Collective is now the exclusive U.S. retailer of British independent watchmaker Garrick. To learn more about us and check out our full inventory, visit collectivehorology.com. On this episode of the podcast, we're going to peel back the curtain on one of the biggest weeks in the world of watches and wonders. We'll talk about what it's like to be both a retailer and a journalist on the ground at this event, what meetings are like, how the actual space is put together, and what really goes on behind the scenes.
Our guest today is Zach Kazan, managing editor of Worn and Wound. Zach's been a watch lover since his young teenage years, and while his career started in higher education, his passion won out, and now Zach spends his days covering all things horological. We met Zach in person for the first time a few years back when we started our sponsorship of the Wind Up Watch Fair, and we've always loved Zach's passion for unusual and offbeat watches. So, Zach, welcome to Open Work.
Asher and Gabe, thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be on your podcast. Congratulations on the podcast. I've been listening to the first few episodes and really enjoying it. So I'm happy to be here.
Thanks, man. I'd love to dive right in here because this is a topic that I think is on everybody's minds as we're just a few days away now from Watches and Wonders. And first, I think it's good to just set a little bit of context. Watches and Wonders definitely used to run in parallel as a second trade show, sort of a smaller trade show to what we saw at Basel. And with Basel going away, the two have really combined into this new event. So formerly SIHH, now Watches and Wonders. And in many ways, it's almost turned into a Geneva Watch Week because there's more than just one show happening in Geneva during this period in either late March or this year in early April. So, you know, before we even get into what's going on, kind of want to just like paint a picture of what's happening in Geneva that week and what it looks like to be on the ground. You know, Zach, I think the last time we saw you there, we bumped into you in the hallway of the Pal Expo, which is where I want to sort of anchor this conversation, what the Pal Expo is, what it looks like, and why we're all always so dehydrated there, which is probably an interesting thing to start with. So let's talk about the event. The event itself is a trade show. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it certainly exists kind of like in the context of a large trade show that used to exist, but Basel World Trade Show. And there's trade show activity that happens there, but I think there's also a lot more that happens at Watches and Wonders. But I think, you know, primarily, yeah, I would say I would describe it as a very large trade show.
One of the things that was interesting to me about Watches and Wonders is, you know, I had seen Basel World and SIHH for years as an outsider to the industry. Mm-hmm. And to me, they were media platforms. They were these events where essentially watches were announced and launched. And that's really how I conceived of it. You know, I can't remember when it was, but like at one point, Ben Clymer referred to Basel World as like the Super Bowl of watches. Mm-hmm. And I think for me, that really resonated because my understanding of it was, oh, it's a media event and it's a media moment. It's a cultural moment for watches. What surprised me actually when I was at Watches and Wonders for the first time, and Asher's heard this description, is I call it like the invasion of the suits, because I was just shocked by how many people are on the trade show floor there in a business setting. You know, it's a business conference, and I would say 95% of the people there are wearing a suit and tie or, you know, whatever other appropriate business. It's mostly men, overwhelmingly male. And it's like, it's a lot of retailers, it's a lot of brand representatives, so sales representatives from the brands from around the world. And I was just actually shocked by how formal it was and how business driven it was. I don't think, like, I'd known it was a quote unquote trade show, but I didn't really realize the extent to which until I went there in person, because so much of what I had seen was what you and other people in the media had portrayed of the event, not the actual inner workings and the business meetings of it all. So that was sort of surprising to me.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. So my first time going to Watches and Wonders, this will be our Worn and Wound's third year going and my third time going. And I had that same thought the first year. You know, really more specifically, my thought was, who are all these people? Because there's just, it's thousands and thousands of people attend Watches and Wonders, and obviously only a small sliver of them are doing what I'm doing, working on the media side. The vast majority of them are, with watch brands and on the on the sales side or the business side in some capacity. So, it's not often discussed, I guess, the trade show aspect of it, because I think it's less important as a trade show, maybe in a watch environment where releases are happening all year long, and there's more kind of like transparency into the business anyway. The watch industry doesn't need one large trade show at the beginning of the year. But obviously, as media, we're bringing you information on the watches and new releases, as they happen. That's our primary focus. So, but yeah, I think it's important to remember that there's a lot going on at the show beyond just, here are new watches, for you to write about. There's real business being done.
So let's talk about that. The very first time I went to Watches and Wonders, it was still SIHH, and I was going in as a in my former career. So I was there as a partner, and like you, I was sort of surprised at the sheer volume and the scale of it. But now that Gabe and I go as retailers, for us, the trade show component, putting aside, the camaraderie of seeing other folks in your industry, the trade show component is actually the number one reason that we're there.
Sure.
And what that means is we are building a schedule on a daily basis where we are quite literally just moving from booth to booth of people that we are either currently retailers of or in business with in one way or another, or going to meet with other people with whom we wish to be in business with or are planning projects for the future. And those meetings for us follow a relatively straightforward path. These meetings are only 30 minutes long on average. And for anyone who's ever been to a trade show of any variety, I think, there's a few things that are pretty consistent, which is it's exhausting. Yeah, because you're constantly just always on socially. So if you're an introvert, like this is probably, an intense experience, to put it mildly, and I think when you go into these meetings, what has to happen there, aside from the handshakes and the it's the nice to see yous and the rest of it, for us as retailers, we're seeing most of that year's novelties, or as many as they're willing to show us. And then we're making decisions about where we're going to invest our money in wholesale and buying watches. So in many ways, we're literally there to buy. And it's a very serious thing. And it's funny because, of course, I think we mentioned this on previous podcasts. When a brand says they are sold out, they're talking about being sold out to the retailer. So this is where these brands are looking to show, what they believe their strongest sellers are going to be. In some cases, get feedback, because there might be a watch coming later in the year, and a retailer might say, yeah, here's what I know about the market right now. You might want to consider X, Y, or Z, and maybe they take that feedback, or maybe they don't. But so much of what's happening in those meetings for us is tied to what we think we're going to be able to sell that year, what we really want to sell, and also providing feedback back to the brand. When you meet with a partner, I'm thinking those are probably slightly different conversations, Zach.
Yeah, it's very different. For us, it's really about getting hands-on time with the watches themselves. There's usually a presentation involved with someone from the brand, kind of like walking us through a collection in detail. There are always watches out to handle and to photograph. That's a big piece of it as well. A lot of brands provide like special little rooms to, for photography and media production, and we certainly appreciate that and take advantage of that whenever we can. On the media side, it's kind of exactly as I think most people would expect. It's brands trying to put these watches in their best light and convincing us to cover them. There's no guarantee of coverage. We make meetings with brands that we're interested in that we cover anyway, and we are often surprised at the show to see what they're offering and making decisions in real time about what to feature on the website, how to feature those watches on the website, and sort of like planning over the course of like that week and following weeks, and really on to the rest of the spring and summer about how we're going to feature those.
One of the things you mentioned, and this ties back to who you're meeting with and why, but one of the things you mentioned was like, there's probably not a ton of value for Watches and Wonders as a trade show in terms of where things are launched and retailers placing orders, because of course we now live in a digital age, and a watch can be launched anytime, and assets for that watch are digital and can be with a dealer or a journalist in minutes and all that kind of thing. But I know for Asher and for me, one of the things that was surprising in terms of the value, and Asher, you're right. Yes, we do go there. We do place orders, and that really does happen. Like quite literally, we'll see a watch and we'll say, oh, we'll take X of these. When will we have them? But I think really the value for us is in the relationships we build there. And that was one of the things that was the most surprising to me. I really thought as going there as a retailer, it would be really driven around ordering. And I think now we look at Watches and Wonders and a successful Watches and Wonders, not necessarily as a place where we've placed orders, because truly, Zach, you're right. We can place orders anytime, anywhere. What's critical are the relationships. And I'll give an example. A couple of years ago, we just wandered into the booth of a brand that wasn't particularly busy, and we met the owner of that brand, and we had a conversation and discussed a project, the potential for a project there. And that's the kind of thing that would never happen in a purely digital world. The serendipity of meeting someone, seeing something that you weren't expecting and all that is just something that you can't really replicate. So there's a ton of value for building a relationship with the brands you work with, either as a journalist or a retailer. Seeing things hands-on does have value. The serendipity of bumping into someone from the industry that you weren't expecting to see, and who knows where that leads, is interesting. But I think one of the questions a lot of people have is about how those relationships actually play out. And in particular, when you go into the booth of a brand, who exactly are you meeting with? Are you meeting with the watchmakers? Are you meeting with the CEO of the brand? Are you meeting with someone from your region? I'll speak for us. It really varies on the brand and the size of the brand and the nature of the brand. Sometimes we do meet with the CEO. Sometimes we meet with the sales team. Sometimes we just meet with the person we work with on a daily basis in the United States. And so it really does vary. But going in as a journalist, you guys are going down into a room, sitting down with the brand. Who exactly are you talking to? Who exactly is showing you watches? And how does that actually unfold?
Well, similarly, it varies quite a bit for us. And I think it really varies depending on the size of the brand. For the small independents that we meet with, it's very likely we'll meet, with the owner of the brand or the founder of the brand. For larger brands, it's a little bit different. We might have access sometimes to an executive, at the brand, maybe for like an interview, perhaps a podcast or a video interview. The presentations are usually conducted by brand staff or press relations folks that they employ for the event, who are trained on those watches to kind of like show us the features of the watches and explain the collections and walk us through them. The meetings are for the most part, you talked about the invasion of the suits. I like that description. I think once you get, for us anyway, once you actually get into a meeting, it's usually pretty casual and pretty relaxed. You have this experience of kind of being on the show floor with all this like activity kind of buzzing around you. Again, thousands of people. It's a large space, but it gets very crowded. And you walk into a brand's booth, and you're kind of led into a room, specifically, for this presentation, and it suddenly gets very quiet. And they offer you, an espresso or a water or whatever, and you have 30 minutes or 45 minutes or whatever it is to kind of like talk about the watches and see them, in a much more private kind of like sane setting. Like the rest of Watches and Wonders is insane. Like there's so much activity happening all the time. I often find that getting into a brand's booth, kind of once those like doors close and it's a little quieter, that's a much more relaxing, kind of sedate experience, at least from what I've found over the last few years.
So we keep describing the booths, and I want to zoom out for a second and just give people a little bit of an idea of what this space looks like and feels like.
Yeah.
So Watches and Wonders, the event itself, takes place at a giant, I suppose, exhibition hall called the Palexpo, which is essentially right next to the Geneva airport. You can see it across the street when you land in Geneva. And every morning there is this vast network of shuttle buses that pick people up and take them from, all manner of hotels and locations around the city to the Palexpo. When you get there, there is an extremely intense and comprehensive security screening, which, makes a lot of sense when you think about it. because of course within the walls of the PAL Expo are hundreds of millions of dollars worth of watches. And even though so many of us are in this industry in one way or another, security is a legitimate thing there. So people go through a very intense screening process. In fact, I recall Gabe being stopped relatively a few times when we were there last time because his photo on his badge had, wavy hair, but he had short hair, and that was no bueno. So they had to check him out. And Gabe is just a generally sketchy guy to begin with. So, it makes sense. But anyway, once you enter the hall, this is a trade show, as we've mentioned, but it is a very high production value trade show. So, each of the individual brands essentially, to one degree or another, build out their own universe. And some of those spaces are dramatic. I mean, Rolex and Tudor are multi-floored office buildings that get constructed within the space. Patek as well. Chopard literally builds a house, all the way to smaller independents, which are in one shared area, which are closer to the concept of what you're probably picturing in your head when you think of a booth. And spread out through all this are these bars and snack bars, essentially. And I bring that up just because hilariously every year they all have the same menu. So you sit down and the food is served in these minuscule little bowls. And by the way, I'm deeply grateful because bless their hearts, they pay for all that stuff on the food and the drink, and that's great. But there's, they will always be a very generous pour of wine if you want it, but a comically small amount of water if you ask for it. So
hence the dehydration
I referenced.
Yeah.
So people are constantly running around trying to sit down, have a tiny little bowl of food, drink a little bit of water, maybe at the end of the day have a glass of wine, and then race from one side of the hall to another to go into these meetings. So in your head, picture a very, very lavish version of a car show or CES or whatever your anchor may be in the industry that you're in. That's what it looks like, which I think begs a really interesting question for a lot of us. You walk in there and you can tell it's a high production value, high cost space. So there are a lot of questions I think come up around and perhaps misconceptions around who's paying for people to attend and how people get there. So I'll handle the first part of that. Retailers, we all pay our own way. So the airplane tickets that we buy, sometimes the hotel rooms that we get, we cover that ourselves. Watches and Wonders and the FHH, which is the producing entity behind it, do cover some amount of hotel rooms for dealers, but the total number of nights is predicated by how many meetings you have and whom you're meeting with, because someone's footing the bill for that. It's a consolidated bucket of money, essentially, but they're not handing that out. Like, that really is tied to a very specific metric. And for dealers too, the way that we're invited is actually pretty straightforward. We have to be sponsored by a brand. A brand has to say, we intend to do business with these people, and we can provide them, one ticket or two badges or what have you to attend and be there. But that's really it, because of the hard costs associated with the food and the drink, the limited attendance in the space, and of course the hotel rooms. So, it's a significant investment for a retailer to be there. And I have to imagine from a production standpoint, it's a significant investment for you too, or for any publication. I mean, can you talk a little bit about that? I mean, what's involved in you guys packing your bags and going to Geneva?
Logistically, it's very complicated. It's by far the most complicated endeavor we take on the editorial side of the business all year. Involves a lot of planning. And, to your point about the expense, it's quite expensive. Our experience on the media side is similar to yours. The FHH and the event pay for a certain number of nights in a hotel, but the airfare is completely on us. Incidentals, meals outside of the venue and so forth are on us. And that's no small thing, because Geneva, if you haven't been there, is a very expensive city. It's, hard to walk around in Geneva without spending a considerable amount of money on, any sort of, like everyday sort of item, like, even like a simple meal. So yeah, the expense is considerable. We feel that it's worth it just because of, some of like the networking opportunities you alluded to, Gabe. It's really like the one time a year where everyone's kind of in the same place in the watch world. So that's really valuable from that standpoint. And of course, being able to see all these watches, when they're released in real time, is incredibly important for us. But it's quite complicated. And you have a certain number of days at the PAL Expo, and trying to coordinate meetings among our relatively small team. We'll bring 4 people this year, myself, Zach Weiss, Cat Shoulders, as well as a videographer, trying to cover as much as we want to cover it's quite an endeavor. Our calendars are jam packed. There's not a lot of room for errors, so it's quite complex.
Yeah, that's interesting. I always figured that the brands paid full freight for any editor, any media who wanted to be there. I'm sure there's probably criteria too around who even gets offered a hotel room and who doesn't. Just like Asher was saying, for retailers, there definitely is. When we book our trip to Geneva, we book it out as soon as we can book the plane tickets. We book our trip and we book our own hotel, because there's no telling how many meetings we'll have, if the FHH will pay for a hotel room for us, or if they even will for as many nights as we need. It's sort of a black box in that way. And it's, as far as travel for the year goes, traveling to Watches and Wonders and traveling to Geneva is the most expensive travel expense we have, because of the costs of flights, meals, hotel rooms, in particular during that week in Geneva.
Yes.
Going back to the Super Bowl analogy, it's like going to, Las Vegas for the Super Bowl, although Las Vegas has more hotel rooms than Geneva.
True.
So it gets really expensive. And I think, there's, my perception, at least I'll speak, was like, oh, the journalists are getting wined and dined, and the dealers are getting wined and dined, and they're flying first class, and everything's being paid for. And it was kind of interesting to see that that's not the case, and also interesting to hear from you. And Stephen Pulver at Revolution told us the same thing. Like the expense that the media outlets take on is quite high for this. And I think, going back a little bit, Asher, to what you're describing in the build out of Watches and Wonders, one of the other things that struck me in the build out of the space is like, there's a hierarchy within the event. So in other words, when you get in as a journalist or as a retailer, I mean, these are the people who really have sort of, quote, access to the first few days of Watches and Wonders, where the public is not allowed in, sort of the industry focusing. Once you're in, you're only kind of sort of in. Like, you can get into the Palexpo, but there's this whole hierarchy and system of access. So I think another perception is, and I probably didn't help it with one of my descriptions earlier, that you can sort of wander into any booth and meet with anyone. You really can't. So you need to have an appointment. If you walked up, and I'm just going to pick a brand out of a hat. Let's say I walked up to the Cartier booth. And I'm just picking on Cartier. I don't know if this is fair.
No, that's a perfect example.
Okay, so I'm going to give Cartier as an example. If I walked into the Cartier booth and I said, "I'm a retailer, I'd like to see some watches," they would say, "Do you have an appointment?" And I would say, "No," and they'd say, "We can't help you." So there's like levels of access upon levels of access. Additionally, there's all these other spaces within Watches and Wonders that have controlled access. So let's say you want to get something to eat. Zach, you made the point. Asher, you made the point. Like, there are these sort of stalls set up throughout the space that have coffee and food and things like that set up. There's also restaurants. So part of this, the build out, like, they build out full service restaurants inside of Watches and Wonders. I can't make as a retailer, I cannot make a reservation at that restaurant to eat. Only a brand can. And in fact, there are some, quote, restaurants within Watches and Wonders at which only the executives of a brand can make a reservation and host someone. So like, there's spaces in there that like you just can't get access to. And I know editorial folks and media have access to like a media lounge. I can't just walk in there. If I saw you hanging out in the media lounge and I tried to walk in, I would be stopped. So this is like another thing that was like really interesting to me, is like how access at Watches and Wonders is very strictly controlled and gated, which is very different from a lot of other shows. Like, I used to go to CES in a past career, and at CES, you could walk into any booth on the floor and basically meet with kind of anyone, except like if you wanted to go to the Samsung booth, it's heavily controlled or things like that. But like, there's a lot of access at other trade shows. But Watches and Wonders is very controlled and very hierarchical. And that was something to me that was both kind of surprising, but frankly also a bit disappointing.
Yeah, the executive restaurant thing, it still kind of blows my mind. The press lounge is an interesting kind of kind of feature of the show. That's where we, historically we spend quite a bit of time there. And there's, I think you guys are probably aware, there's slightly different food available in the press lounge. Like they give you these little,
wait, really?
yeah, like they give you these little like cheese sandwiches and
sandwich. We don't get sandwiches out on the floor.
Yeah. And
wait, this is actually news to me. Hang on. You don't have to order the gyozas?
They just they
have bagels too.
The bagels are not
what?
They barely meet the definition of a bagel. I wouldn't listen. The food is a whole rabbit hole. We can certainly get into it.
Sorry, my mind is blown by that. I didn't.
Well, no, it's
please continue.
So you sit down at the press lounge, and immediately, like waiters, they'll serve you whatever beverage you want, espresso or Coke or sparkling water or whatever, and they just kind of like continuously bring you little plates of little like finger sandwiches, basically little like kind of like mini cheese and meat sandwiches, and like sometimes there's like tuna or salmon or something a little bit more luxurious, and it's basically. It's kind of like airline food quality, like good airline food, but not like, I wouldn't go out and order one of these sandwiches in my like hometown or anything, but like there's something about someone bringing them to you that's kind of nice. But that's like, I say this just to say that's like the most luxurious thing that happens to us probably at Watches and Wonders is like the waiter bringing you these little sandwiches. It's a treat, but it kind of like tops out there too.
Well, now that we all know about your aristocratic sandwich service, which was unaware, I was thoroughly unaware of, but I'm now very jealous of. I do want folks to also get a bigger picture. That's the Pal Expo, and there's I don't know the exact count, but something like 40 brands are there this year, something like that.
I think so, yeah.
But that's a fraction of what's happening in Geneva. In addition to what's going on at the Pal Expo during this week, there is a very central hotel called the Beau Rivage, where many, many brands of certain, primarily independents. So, that's where Debatoon tends to camp out, for example. I'm not sure if they're there this year, but during Geneva Watch Days, for example, Urwerk was there. And these are essentially hotel suites that get rented out by brands. And for context, renting a booth at Watches and Wonders, I don't know the figures, but I have to imagine the space itself, just the space, is, at minimum high 5 figures and goes way up from there. And that's before you staff it, build it, design it. So these are major, major, major financial investments. So building out the Beau Rivage is, very convenient for a lot of people. It's central and it's local, but has obviously a lower cost relative to what you'd see at the Pal Expo. But in addition to that, there are also smaller shows and events that are happening throughout the week. Gabe and I, our personal favorite one, perhaps unsurprising as we're indie watch lovers and retailers, is something called the AHCI. And for those who don't know, that's essentially a trade organization that supports independent watchmakers. And what they essentially do is rent out a art gallery in downtown Geneva. And it is in many ways the complete inverse of an experience of what you had at Watches and Wonders in the best possible way. You go in and there's usually some form of exhibit on the top floor. Last year, there was a big clock exhibit, which is pretty awesome. And then you go downstairs into the basement.
Yeah, it's quite literally in an art gallery. So unlike what you experience at Watches and Wonders or even the Beau Rivage, which is very formal and sort of staid, this is like a bohemian art gallery. And so that's the exhibit upstairs. It's like an art gallery exhibit upstairs. But then tell us about downstairs.
But then you go downstairs where you see the cash bar,
yes,
and a bunch of basically folding tables that are set up. But manning these folding tables is a veritable who's who of the most storied watchmakers in the world of indies. So you go downstairs and there's Ludovic Bayard, there's Viney Halter. That was the first time I had the opportunity to handle Raoul Page's watch and to meet the man himself, see his automatons essentially, and basically within this, like, I don't know, 600, 700 square foot space are some of the most incredible talents in watchmaking. And that place turns into just a hell of a party every night. And it's because it is so much more relaxed in many ways. Now, mind you, business gets done there. There are, if you're a retailer of any of those brands, like, you're still going to go and you're going to see Ludovic, or you're going to go and you're going to talk to Viney Halter or whatever. But gone is any pretense. These are not these are not business conversations in the same way that we have at the PAL Expo. These are really, one-on-one interpersonal relationships with, brands that are one person, two people, maybe three people. Like, that's it. And for lovers of the independent watch world, I get that there are now tickets that you can attend Watches and Wonders, but honestly, I would go to the AHCI, which is free, and you will see in one place things that you may never have the opportunity to see anywhere else, because maybe there's only one or two or three of them in the whole wide world, and then have the absolute joy of being able to speak to the watchmaker too. So for Gabe and for I, that's the place where you can literally and proverbially loosen your tie and really hang out with some incredible watchmakers. And then, did you go to Time to Watches last year, Zach?
So no, actually, I missed AHCI last year. I went the first year that I went to Geneva for Watches and Wonders Week, and it's a blast. I highly, I co-sign everything you just said. AHCI is fantastic. This will be the first year that I'll be at Time to Watches. It just hasn't worked out in terms of our schedule that I was able to attend either of the last 2 years. Very excited to be at Time to Watches, I think for a full day this year. And lots of kind of like smaller brands that are, kind of in the worn and wound wheelhouse, like Zinn will be there. I'm very excited to meet with them, and a whole bunch of other brands. But yeah, no, it's really, important to realize that there's so much other watch activity happening throughout the city of Geneva during the course of the week beyond Watches and Wonders, that, and that's part of what makes scheduling and getting to everything so complicated, is there's so much to see over an expanse of space within the city. But yeah, Time to Watch is very, very exciting. AHCI will be great. And of course, all the independent brands at the Beau Rivage and other hotels too.
I realize I probably should have added context to that. Time to Watches is another show that's happening concurrently with Watches and Wonders in Geneva, and is, as Zach mentioned, a number of independent brands are also exhibiting there. Similarly, around the city, ateliers tend to open up their doors. So, you'll find, you might find Max Buser camped out at the Mad Gallery, the Madhouse. You'd find Felix and Martin at Urwork's beautiful, relatively new facility in the Old Town. I'm sure if you knocked on the door at Akrivia, you find Regia Bergepi there and the rest. So, a lot of folks who are lucky enough to have boutiques or ateliers in Geneva utilize that space as well, which I think brings us to another really interesting component of Watches and Wonders, which is what happens at night.
What does happen at night? I'm working at night, guys. I don't know what you guys are doing at night.
That's a great point.
Exactly. And I think this is something I'd love to get into, because I don't know necessarily that folks understand, because why would they? Like, what goes into that? And I'll give you a quick story about that. For the evenings for us, we're generally going out to dinner with a partner brand, for example. There are sometimes evening events. Larger brands sometimes do quite theatrical, large events. Some smaller brands take everyone out to dinner. And, that's always a really exciting and great opportunity, because you get to hang out with colleagues who are who are retailers of the same brand, maybe from different countries, and get to know people. And that's just really cool. But I remember coming back to our hotel last year. We were staying at the same hotel that US Media was staying in. And this hotel was wonderful for many reasons, not least of which being that it had an actual bar, like a real bar, which is not normal. And sitting at the bar was a pretty well-known watch reporter who was it was like 12:30 or 1 a.m, and he was sitting there just tweaking pixels on photos, finishing articles, and was surrounded by the rest of the editorial team from that same publication. And they just looked they looked absolutely knackered.
Yeah.
And, there I was sauntering up, just, ready for martini number 3. And these folks were cranking along. So could you tell us a little bit about what the reality of, what happens after 5 o'clock for you? What goes down?
So we certainly do take part in some of those dinners and sort of like post, PAL Expo closing events. We get invited to those, and we like to attend. And so we do go to those dinners and enjoy it. But there is also work to be done, and we take advantage of the the time difference. Geneva's 6 hours ahead of the East Coast. So at like 12 or 1 o'clock, as you described, like you could conceivably be putting together an article or a post like for that day, for that evening, and yeah, it's exhausting. There's a ton of work. You're basically you're scrambling, to get to meetings, all day long, running around, from end to end of the PAL Expo, writing and editing photos or whatever in between meetings and what little time you have, and then at a certain point you do have to put pen to paper or get a keyboard and actually start putting together the articles on these watches in real time, and that happens late at night. At least it has for us a lot of the time. So it's quite tiring. There's a lot of kind of like adrenaline that sort of powers you through, and which it's a very exciting time. I should say I love Watches and Wonders. It's a really great experience every year, and I can't wait to get back. But yeah, it's exhausting, and there's not nearly enough sleep, and it's really like a massive amount of work.
It is. I mean, it's truly exhausting. Asher, as you were describing sort of the broader landscape in Geneva, and I will triple co-sign on the AHCI. I mean, that's just one of the most fun events, period, of anything really I do great. all year, and it is the perfect antidote to the invasion of the suits. But I think Watches and Wonders is literally Watches and Wonders, but it's also this broader, Asher, as you were describing, kind of Geneva Watch Week, or this ecosystem of different events happening in Geneva. And we at Collective, we're in the LA area. And for anyone who's ever spent any time in Los Angeles, you'll notice there's a disproportionate amount of advertising for movies here. So if you're driving on the freeway or anything like that in Los Angeles, you'll see billboard after billboard after billboard after billboard is an advertisement for a movie or a TV show or something like that. And I would have to imagine that there's no greater market for movie advertising, entertainment advertising than Los Angeles, which is ironic because this is where most of that stuff is made, and you'd think people would be across it here. But of course, a big part of what's going on there is the executives at the movie studios or the streamers or the TV networks, the media companies, like to see the advertisements for their own stuff.
Yeah.
And they like to signal to each other, who's got the hottest IP, who's got the most interesting release, who's been nominated. So it's a lot of signaling within the media industry that happens here. The same thing is going on in Geneva that week with the brands. And so, yes, there's this ecosystem of events, but just like there's a hierarchy within the Watches and Wonders event itself, it does kind of feel like there's a hierarchy among these events, and that participation in one event or another, or maybe not participating, signals something to the industry. So a lot of times we'll hear from brands that their ambition, right, is to graduate to Watches and Wonders, because then they'll signal to themselves, to their competitors, and to the broader industry that they've really arrived. Conversely, we've had brands who we work with us say, like, I'm not participating in Watches and Wonders anymore. It's a waste. I just don't want to do it. I don't need to do it. I'm past the point where participating in Watches and Wonders makes sense for me. And so I guess this is for both of you guys. Like, let's say you agree with this premise that there's a lot of signaling that happens based on where you're presenting and how big your booth is and all that kind of stuff. Like, does it actually mean, it certainly seems like it means something to people in the watch industry and the executives. Does it mean anything to you where a brand decides they want to participate, or how big their booth is, or how nice their build out is, or any of that kind of stuff? Like, does it give you any real information? Is that helpful to you, or does it feel sort of ego driven and maybe not the best use of resources?
Well, I think I don't personally like place a judgment on brands that do or do not participate in Watches and Wonders or any other show in any particular way. I think, part of the whole, ethos of Worn and Wound, from the very beginning is that, all of these brands kind of deserve, to be taken seriously if the watches are good. That's sort of like the bottom line is that, we give the same attention to, like a $500 watch from a micro brand as, if it's good and we like it, as any new Rolex, or any other, like high-end independent or whatever, if the watches are good. So that's what it really all boils down to. What I will say is that it's interesting to observe which brands are kind of like moving in and moving out of Watches and Wonders year to year. Just kind of, if you're in the industry, or if you're a collector or a hobbyist and watching the industry, that can be kind of just interesting to clock. Pardon the pun. Who's moving in and who's moving out. I don't know that it really means anything substantively for us in terms of like how we cover those brands or how we feel about those brands. Again, it all comes down to the watches themselves. But I find it fascinating, to see when a brand is decides one year that they're not going to participate in Watches and Wonders, or when another brand decides this is the first year that they are going to participate in Watches and Wonders. As someone who's in the industry, I think it's interesting to observe.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, a good example is we have a new brand coming into Watches and Wonders this year, Bremont. And that's clearly a very strategic decision with their hire of Davide Serrato, for example. And they wanted a platform, I have to imagine, to really showcase whatever they have in store. So there's definitely like clear strategy at play. Whether it's financial, whether it's from a product standpoint or what have you. As we wrap this conversation up, I have one broad question just to ask both of you guys, and then we can say thanks to Zach. I'm curious, not from a product standpoint, but from a business standpoint, what you guys are going to keep your eyes on at Watches and Wonders. And I'll give you an example about what I'm thinking about. For me, we've talked on previous episodes, and I think everyone's aware the industry has gone through a significant readjustment over the last couple of years. And right now we're actually heading into a period where one would be fair to assume that the watches we're going to see released came from product cycles that were developed in 2020 and 2021 at the height of the market. And I'm really curious to see how manufacturers are going to handle that, because I think you could argue that a watch that might have sold really well in 2020 or 2021 may not necessarily be the watch everybody's looking for this year. A good example of that is like a lot of the raised eyebrows that the Piaget Polo re-release got at $73,000. So for me, one of the things I'm going to be looking for is, are the watches that are coming out now the ones that were developed in that period, or are the watches coming out now ones that were strategically designed for where the market is today? So that's one thing I'm looking for. Gabe, Zach, curious what you guys are going to look for at the show.
Yeah, for me, it's definitely related. And, when I think about Watches and Wonders for us for the last couple of years, I don't really think about the watches themselves that were released. In fact, I'd be hard pressed to tell you, which year, which watch was released. It's all
funny how that happens, isn't it? It's like very.
It really is. But what sticks with me is the vibe of the show, and the vibe of the show is going to be different for everyone. So the vibe of the show over the last few years for me as a retailer was, let's go back to 2022. So I don't think the watch industry quite realized it, but March of 2022 was essentially when the quote unquote watch bubble peaked. So Watches and Wonders happened during the peak of the COVID watch frenzy. And sort of the vibe we took away, and Asher will remember this, it was a very humbling show, because we went there when we were just starting to really build our retail business. And so we were talking to a number of brands at that point, not just about collaborations, but picking them up for retail. And it was very humbling, because the tenor of what we'd heard essentially from every brand was, well, demand is so strong, we don't have anything for you. I mean, I wish we did, we just don't have anything. Or we're not adding retailers, or in fact, we're eliminating some retailers. So how could we even talk to you about opening a door? And last year that began to change, where the tenor sort of softened up a little bit. And I think, part of it has to do with the fact that at that point we had a year under our belt as a retailer and we had demonstrated some credibility, but the tone was still, okay, we're going to think about this. We need to let you know. And it was very measured. I'll be curious to see, frankly, what the tone is this year. And I can tell you, in the last few months, in the last year, really, the tables have begun to turn from us. And look, I know any industry is cyclical and the pendulum swings one way or another, but at this point, we're beginning to have more brands ask us to carry them then we're going out and asking brands ourselves to carry them. And most brands who approach us, we say no to, not because we don't like them, but we have to be very thoughtful about how we manage the number of brands we have in our inventory and properly introducing each brand to our customers and things like that. So I'll be very interested to see what the vibe is this year. What are we hearing as retailers from the brands in terms of their disposition towards retailers, their what they tell us about their level of supply and what they can deliver? And I wonder if it's going to continue to trend, and how much, basically, Asher, to your point, awareness there is from the brands about the reality of the current watch market. So we shall see what the vibe is, and I know we'll do an episode from Watches and Wonders, and we'll talk about what we're seeing and hearing and what the vibe is on the floor. So stay tuned for that. But Zach, how about you guys?
Very similar. I'm curious to see what the tone is of attendees and brands. Obviously, the watch market has changed quite a bit over the last year, 2 years or so. So yeah, I'll be watching that very, very closely as well. I'm also kind of interested to see what kinds of larger product strategies these brands will be taking. Last year, I noticed that there were a handful of brands, really of running the gamut from small independents to very large, well-known, brands that are kind of anchors of the show, releasing just one watch, highlighting just a single watch at the show, which I thought was an interesting trend last year. Thinking of Longa and Ulysses Nardin specifically come to mind. So I'm wondering if we'll see more of that, less of that. It struck me as being kind of a somewhat unusual development last year. So it's something I'm looking for this year as well.
Well, Zach, thanks so much for joining us, and we're going to see you soon at Watches and Wonders. Now, speaking of which, as I mentioned, we're going to be recording our next episode at Watches and Wonders itself. So a little bit of a programming note here. Typically, we release episodes every other Monday. So instead of releasing that episode on Monday, April 8th, we're going to be releasing that episode on Wednesday, April 10th. That means we're going to have a day or so to go to Watches and Wonders, check things out, and report live from the show for you guys. So hopefully those extra 2 days are well worth their while, because we'll be able to provide some timely and topical reflections on what we're seeing on the ground at Watches and Wonders. Until then, thanks so much for listening. This is Open Work. It's a production of Collective Horology. You can find us online at collectivehorology.com. And you can find our guest, Zach Kazan, at Worn and Wound. That's wornandwound.com. And if you'd like to get in touch with any questions, feedback, or suggestions, we'd love to hear them. Just email us at podcast@collectivehorology.com.